The Dominion assembly had all the subtlety of a neutron star collision, wrapped in designer silk and sprinkled with enough precious metals to fund a small war, which, considering the attendees, wasn't entirely inappropriate. The massive crystalline structure orbiting the dead system of Keth Prime served as neutral ground for the galaxy's most prestigious gathering of genetically enhanced thugs, who'd managed to convince entire star systems that having really impressive great-great-grandfathers somehow qualified them to rule. The assembly hall itself stretched across 17 levels, each one representing a different tier of what the galaxy's elite laughingly called warrior heritage, because apparently somewhere in the vast expanse of civilized space, someone had decided that the best way to measure a species' worth was by cataloging exactly how many things their ancestors had successfully punched into submission. The logic was flawless, really. Why bother with trivial matters like technological advancement, cultural development, or philosophical enlightenment, when you could simply point to a family tree decorated with skull counts? At the apex of this monument to organized violence sat the Crimson Fang dynasty, whose representatives lounged on thrones, carved from the bones of extinct megafauna, because nothing said we're totally stable leaders, like sitting on furniture made from dead animals that had been minding their own business on some distant world. The current heir, a mountain of engineered muscle and manufactured intimidation, surveyed the assembly with the kind of casual arrogance that only came from never having experienced actual consequences. His genetic modifications were impressive. Bone density increased by 400%, muscle fibers that could generate enough force to crush titanium, reflexes enhanced to superhuman levels, pain receptors dulled to near non-existent, the finest military-grade enhancements that Daddy's mining fortune could purchase, all wrapped up in a package that had never once been tested against anything more dangerous than training dummies and carefully selected opponents who knew better than to actually win. The other bloodlines arranged themselves according to their own delusions of grandeur. The Iron Talon Consortium, whose ancestors had allegedly conquered 17 systems through pure intimidation, and whose current generation had conquered exactly 0 systems through any means whatsoever. The Void Serpent Syndicate, who traced their lineage back to space pirates and seemed to believe that inheriting stolen goods somehow made them legitimate rulers. The Storm Crown Collective, whose founding myth involved wresting control of weather manipulation technology from its creators, and who apparently thought this made them meteorological royalty. Each family maintained their own elaborate mythology, complete with holographic displays showing carefully edited historical footage of their ancestors doing impressively violent things to other people's ancestors. The fact that most of these legendary warriors had lived in eras where the most advanced weapons were sharp pieces of metal seemed entirely irrelevant to their descendants, who had somehow convinced themselves that genetic memory of sword swinging translated directly into modern leadership capabilities. The caste system they'd constructed around this premise was a masterpiece of circular reasoning. Strong bloodlines deserved to rule because they came from strong bloodlines, and they came from strong bloodlines because they currently ruled, therefore proving they were strong bloodlines. It was the kind of logic that worked perfectly right up until someone pointed out that it didn't actually work at all, but fortunately for the assembled dignitaries, most of the galaxy had been too polite to mention this rather obvious flaw. Into this carefully orchestrated display of inherited intimidation walked Earth's diplomatic representative, and the collective reaction could best be described as the galactic equivalent of trying not to snicker during a funeral service. She was small by the standards of the assembled giants, unenhanced by any visible modifications, and carrying nothing more threatening than a standard diplomatic datapad. Her species' entry into galactic politics had been met with the kind of bemused tolerance typically reserved for precocious children who insisted on sitting at the adult table. Humanity's entire claim to consideration rested on their recent technological achievements, and their amusing insistence that they deserved a voice in galactic affairs, despite lacking any proper warrior heritage whatsoever. They had no legendary battles to point to, no conquered territories to display, no genetic lineage of professional violence to justify their presence. Their homeworld was some unremarkable little rock in a backwater system that had only recently figured out faster than light travel, and their representative looked like a strong breeze might knock her over. The assembled bloodlines watched her approach with the kind of fascination usually reserved for exotic pets, or particularly entertaining court jesters. Here was a species so thoroughly unimpressive that they'd actually sent someone to represent them at a gathering designed to showcase the galaxy's most formidable warrior lineages. The audacity was almost charming in its complete lack of self-awareness. What made it even more amusing was how seriously the human seemed to take the whole affair. She carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested she actually believed she belonged here, among beings who could crack planets, and whose ancestors had carved empires out of the void itself. The disconnect between her obvious physical limitations and her apparent conviction that she had something meaningful to contribute was the kind of entertainment that made these gatherings worthwhile. The Crimson Fang heir leaned back in his throne of ancient bones and allowed himself a small smile. Today's proceedings were going to be far more interesting than usual. The formal strength demonstration ceremony began with all the pomp and circumstance that the galaxy's premier collection of muscle-bound aristocrats could muster, which was considerable. Ancient war drums carved from crystallized starship hulls thundered across the assembly hall, while holographic displays projected the vital statistics of each participating heir: bone density measurements, muscle fiber composition, recorded lifting capacities, and other metrics that would have been more at home in a livestock auction than a diplomatic gathering. The Crimson Fang heir stepped forward first, naturally, because subtlety had never been the family's strong suit. His demonstration involved lifting a block of compressed neutronium that weighed approximately as much as a small moon, holding it above his head for exactly 37 seconds, just long enough for the recording devices to capture every angle before setting it down with the kind of theatrical precision that suggested extensive rehearsal. The assembled crowd offered appropriately appreciative murmurs, though whether they were impressed by the display or simply relieved that he hadn't accidentally dropped it through the floor was unclear. The Iron Talon representative followed with a performance that involved punching through a series of increasingly exotic materials, each one supposedly representing the armor plating of various enemy vessels his ancestors had encountered. The fact that most of these historical armor samples had been specially fabricated for the demonstration using materials specifically chosen to look impressive, while shattering, didn't seem to diminish the enthusiastic applause from the audience. As the ceremony progressed, the commentary from the Bloodline representatives grew increasingly creative in its dismissal of anything that didn't involve impressive displays of brute force. The Void Serpent matriarch observed that true strength could only be measured by one's ability to crush opposition through physical superiority, while completely ignoring the rather obvious fact that her own empire had been built on stealth technology and carefully planned ambushes, rather than dramatic wrestling matches. The Storm-Crowned delegate contributed his own wisdom about the superiority of beings who could face their enemies with naked strength, rather than hiding behind clever gadgets, apparently forgetting that his entire bloodline's claim to fame rested on inheriting weather control systems they'd stolen from their creators, rather than developed themselves. The irony was so thick you could have cut it with one of their ancestors' allegedly legendary swords. Through it all, the human representative stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, maintaining the kind of diplomatic composure that suggested either remarkable patience or a complete failure to understand that she was being systematically insulted by some of the galaxy's most powerful individuals. Her presence had become something of a running joke among the assembled dignitaries, who seemed to find endless entertainment in speculating about exactly how fragile her species must be. The Crimson Fang heir, emboldened by several rounds of fermented Altarian battle wine and the encouraging laughter of his peers, decided to elevate the entertainment value of the proceeding. His voice carried easily across the assembly hall, enhanced by vocal modifications that made every word resonate with the kind of authority that could only be purchased through extensive genetic engineering. "Behold the representative of Earth," he announced, gesturing toward the human with the kind of theatrical flourish typically reserved for presenting exotic curiosities at traveling circus. A species so delicate that they require artificial atmospheres to survive in space, mechanical devices to travel between stars, and protective suits to walk on worlds that proper warriors would consider mildly refreshing. The laughter that followed was the kind of polite, cultured amusement that the galaxy's elite had perfected over centuries of practice. It carried just enough genuine mirth to be insulting while maintaining the thin veneer of diplomatic courtesy that prevented it from becoming an outright declaration of hostility. The Iron Talon heir contributed his own observation about how touching it was that humanity had managed to develop interstellar travel despite being constructed from materials so fragile that a stern conversation might cause structural damage. This earned another round of appreciative chuckles from the assembled bloodlines, who seemed genuinely delighted by their own wit. The Void Serpent representative suggested that perhaps Earth's diplomatic corps should consider sending holographic projections to future gatherings, since the risk of their physical representatives suffering accidental injury from exposure to normal atmospheric pressure seemed unconscionably high. The suggestion was delivered with the kind of mock concern that made it clear exactly how seriously the galaxy's warrior elite took humanity's attempts at meaningful participation in interstellar affairs. What made the entire exchange even more remarkable was how the bloodlines seemed to genuinely believe their own propaganda about the correlation between physical strength and leadership capability. They had somehow convinced themselves that the ability to lift heavy objects, or punch through expensive materials, translated directly into the wisdom necessary to govern star systems and manage interstellar commerce. The logical disconnect was so profound that it bordered on the surreal. The human representative listened to each insult with the kind of calm attention typically reserved for academic lectures or weather reports. Her expression remained neutral, professional, diplomatic. She neither flinched at the more creative descriptions of human frailty, nor attempted to defend her species against increasingly elaborate characterizations of their supposed inadequacy. This apparent acceptance of their superior wit only encouraged the bloodlines to greater heights of creative mockery. Someone suggested that humans probably required mechanical assistance to open containers of food. Another proposed that Earth's military forces likely consisted primarily of strongly worded letters and carefully organized protest marches. The Crimson Fang heir, drunk on applause and fermented alien beverages, decided to conclude the informal roasting session with what he clearly considered his masterstroke of diplomatic humor. He stood from his throne of ancient bones, spread his genetically enhanced arms in a gesture that encompassed the entire assembly, and delivered his final verdict on humanity's place in galactic civilization. Perhaps, he announced with the kind of timing that suggested extensive practice in front of mirrors, we should invite our human friend to demonstrate the legendary strength of her species. Surely such accomplished diplomats would not hesitate to show us exactly what Earth's finest warriors are capable of achieving. The suggestion was met with the kind of enthusiastic approval typically reserved for particularly clever entertainment proposals. Here was a chance to witness firsthand just how laughably inadequate human physical capabilities really were, all wrapped up in the polite fiction of cultural exchange and mutual understanding. The human representative looked around the assembly hall, taking in the expectant faces of the galaxy's most powerful bloodlines, all waiting to see exactly how amusing her inevitable failure would be. For the first time since arriving, she smiled. The arena that materialized in the center of the assembly hall was a masterpiece of showmanship, masquerading as diplomatic protocol. Holographic barriers shimmered into existence, creating a perfect circle of contained space where the galaxy's elite could observe what they fully expected to be the most entertainingly one-sided demonstration in recent memory. The lighting adjusted automatically to provide optimal viewing angles, because even mock combat deserved proper cinematography when witnessed by beings of such obvious cultural sophistication. The human representative stepped into the designated space with the same unhurried composure she'd maintained throughout the evening's festivities. She removed her diplomatic jacket with methodical precision, folding it neatly and setting it aside as though she were preparing for nothing more strenuous than a routine medical examination. Underneath, her simple utilitarian clothing revealed a frame that looked even more unimpressive when compared to the assembled mountains of genetically enhanced muscle surrounding the arena. The Crimson Fang heir followed her into the circle with considerably more theatrical flair, rolling his shoulders and flexing his artificially enhanced musculature for the benefit of the recording devices. His movements carried the fluid confidence of someone who had never encountered actual opposition, whose every previous contest had been carefully arranged to showcase his superiority, without risking any possibility of genuine challenge, or heaven forbid, actual injury. What the assembled bloodlines failed to appreciate, in their eager anticipation of the coming entertainment, was that they were about to receive a practical education in evolutionary biology. Specifically, they were about to learn why certain species became apex predators not through genetic engineering or inherited advantages, but through the simple expedient of being willing to do whatever was necessary to survive on worlds that actively tried to kill everything living on them. Earth, as it happened, was what xenobiologists politely termed a high-stress environment. What they meant by this clinical description was that humanity's homeworld was essentially a spinning ball of barely contained disasters, where everything from the weather to the wildlife to the geologic activity seemed personally offended by the existence of life and dedicated to correcting this oversight through creative applications of violence. Humans had evolved on a planet where the atmosphere could kill them, the water could kill them, the plants could kill them, the animals could definitely kill them, and even the ground occasionally opened up to swallow entire cities, just to keep things interesting. They had developed as persistence hunters on a world where persistence hunting meant chasing prey until either the prey collapsed from exhaustion, or the human died from any of several hundred environmental hazards that could appear without warning. The result of this extended evolutionary pressure cooking was a species that had learned to treat impossible odds as Tuesday afternoon, and certain death as mild inconvenience. Their bones had developed density levels that approached crystalline structure. Their muscle fibers had evolved to function efficiently under extreme stress for extended periods. Their nervous systems had adapted to process pain as useful information rather than debilitating trauma. Most importantly, they had developed what their philosophers called practical problem-solving skills, and what their enemies called deeply disturbing levels of creative violence. When faced with superior opposition, humans didn't retreat to reconsider their options. They adapted, improvised, and applied exactly as much force as necessary to resolve the situation in their favor. The Crimson Fang heir approached the demonstration with the casual confidence of someone expecting to participate in a brief, mildly amusing interlude before returning to more serious entertainment. He had never fought anything that could actually hurt him, never faced opposition that wasn't carefully calibrated to provide the appearance of challenge, without the risk of actual defeat. His genetic enhancements were impressive by any reasonable standard. His bone density was quadruple that of baseline members of his species. His muscle mass had been increased beyond anything natural evolution could have produced. His reflexes had been accelerated to superhuman levels through careful modification of his nervous system. What his enhancements couldn't account for was fighting someone who had been evolutionarily optimized for exactly this kind of encounter over millions of years of constant desperate survival on a world that treated existence as a privilege that had to be earned daily through successful violence against overwhelming odds. The human representative extended her hand in what appeared to be a gesture of polite greeting, the kind of diplomatic courtesy that civilized beings exchanged before engaging in formal contest. The heir accepted the handshake with magnanimous condescension, secure in his genetic superiority and the entertainment value he was about to provide for his peers. The sound his enhanced bones made when she applied pressure was remarkably similar to the noise expensive crystal makes when it encounters sudden, focused stress. It was a delicate, musical tinkling that seemed almost artistic in its precision, followed by a much less artistic scream that demonstrated exactly how effective his pain-dampening modifications actually were when confronted with compound fractures. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that occurs when an entire room full of people simultaneously realizes that their fundamental assumptions about reality have been politely but firmly corrected by someone who apparently hadn't received the memo about how things were supposed to work. The heir's arm hung at an angle that defied several laws of physics and most definitions of structural integrity. His face displayed the kind of expression typically associated with individuals who have just discovered that their comprehensive insurance policies don't actually cover acts of diplomatic demonstration or educational encounters with apex predators. The human representative released his hand with the same methodical precision she had used to remove her jacket.
brushing imaginary dust from her fingers as though she had just completed a routine maintenance task rather than comprehensively redefining the power dynamics of the most important diplomatic gathering in recent galactic history. The assembled bloodlines stared in the kind of stunned silence that suggested their collective worldview was undergoing rapid and unscheduled reconstruction. Somewhere in the back of the assembly hall, a minor delegate from a tributary system made a quiet note to review their species' defense treaties with Earth, because apparently they had been thinking about humanity in entirely the wrong context. The human representative picked up her diplomatic jacket, shook it out carefully, and put it back on with the unhurried movements of someone who had just concluded a routine business meeting, rather than delivered a comprehensive lesson in practical xenobiology to some of the galaxy's most powerful individuals. The immediate aftermath of the demonstration possessed all the organized chaos of a carefully planned military operation, suddenly encountering an unexpected tactical nuclear device. Medical personnel materialized with the kind of efficiency that suggested the Dominion Assembly had extensive experience dealing with diplomatic incidents that required immediate surgical intervention, though judging by their expression, most of their previous cases had involved alcohol poisoning rather than comprehensive structural failure of expensive genetic modification. The Crimson Fang heir's condition provided an excellent case study in the limitations of purchased superiority when confronted by naturally evolved problem-solving capabilities. His enhanced bones, designed to withstand forces that could crack starship hulls, had apparently not been stress-tested against the grip strength of a species that had spent millennia opening containers, wielding tools, and strangling apex predators with nothing more than standard-issue human hands. The medical team's attempts to stabilize his arm involved several pieces of equipment that looked suspiciously like industrial construction tools, which seemed appropriate given that they were essentially performing emergency repairs on what had previously been considered military-grade hardware. The heir himself maintained a glazed expression that suggested his pain management systems were operating at maximum capacity, while still failing to adequately process the gap between his theoretical invincibility and his current empirical reality. The other bloodline representative experienced their own rapid educational opportunities as the implications of what they had just witnessed filtered through their collective consciousness like particularly unwelcome news updates. The Iron Talon delegation began quietly reviewing their intelligence files on human military capabilities, apparently realizing that they might have been interpreting primitive kinetic weapons and chemical explosive devices in entirely the wrong context. The Void Serpent matriarch discovered a sudden urgent need to consult her tactical advisors about exactly how many human colonies had been established in systems adjacent to her territory, and whether their classification as harmless agricultural settlements might require some revision in light of recent development. Her expression suggested that she was beginning to suspect that harmless agricultural settlements, populated by apex predators, might represent a contradiction in terms. The Stormcrown Collective found themselves reconsidering their previous dismissal of human weather modification requests, particularly in light of the growing realization that a species capable of casual violence might have very different ideas about acceptable atmospheric conditions than beings who had never actually experienced genuine environmental hostility. Throughout the assembly hall, lesser delegates began accessing their personal communication devices with the kind of frantic urgency typically associated with stock market crashes or imminent natural disaster. The Galactic Information Networks experienced a sudden surge in queries about human military doctrine, Earth's colonial expansion patterns, and the precise definition of terms like proportional response and diplomatic solution as understood by beings who had evolved from persistence hunters. The human representative, meanwhile, maintained her position in the center of the arena with the calm professionalism of someone who had just concluded a routine business presentation, rather than fundamentally altered the balance of power in galactic civilization. Her expression suggested mild satisfaction with a job competently performed, as though reducing a genetically enhanced warrior to whimpering medical emergency had been nothing more than checking an item off a diplomatic to-do list. When she finally spoke, her voice carried easily across the stunned assembly without any need for electronic amplification. Her tone remained conversational, professional, the kind of measured delivery typically used for weather reports or quarterly business updates, rather than comprehensive redefinitions of interstellar power dynamics. Earth considers this a successful diplomatic exchange, she announced to the assembled bloodlines, who were still processing the gap between their expectations and the current reality. We're pleased to have demonstrated the practical applications of human conflict resolution techniques without requiring any permanent casualties or significant property damage. The phrase "without requiring any permanent casualties" carried implications that rippled through the assembly like concentric circles of rapidly dawning comprehension. The suggestion that permanent casualties had been an available option, consciously rejected in favor of this more moderate approach, introduced an entirely new variable into their calculations about humanity's role in galactic affairs. The Crimson Fang dynasty's carefully constructed reputation as undefeated champions of genetic superiority underwent immediate and comprehensive revision as news of their heirs' educational experience spread through the Assembly's communication network. Centuries of inherited authority based on theoretical invincibility collapsed into embarrassed medical emergency in the span of approximately 37 seconds, which had to be some kind of record for dynastic reputation management. The other bloodlines found themselves engaging in rapid strategic reassessment as they realized that their entire social structure, based on the premise that genetic enhancements automatically translated into practical superiority, might have been built on fundamentally flawed assumptions. The discovery that actual combat experience and evolutionary optimization could trump expensive modifications introduced uncomfortable questions about the validity of their entire civilization. More immediately, practical concerns began emerging as the assembled delegates realized that they had spent the evening systematically insulting representatives of a species that apparently considered compound fractures to be a form of polite conversation. The diplomatic implications were staggering, particularly for those whose territories bordered human colonial expansion routes, or whose trade agreements might require renegotiation in light of humanity's newly clarified position in the galactic hierarchy. The human representative collected her diplomatic materials with the same methodical precision she had demonstrated throughout the evening, apparently considering her mission successfully accomplished. Her departure from the assembly hall was accompanied by the kind of respectful silence typically reserved for religious ceremonies or funeral processions, though whether the assembled bloodlines were showing respect for her capabilities or mourning their own misconceptions remained unclear. In the aftermath of her exit, the Dominion Assembly continued its proceedings with markedly different energy than had characterized the earlier festivities. The strength demonstrations that had seemed so impressive hours earlier now carried an undertone of desperate overcompensation, as though the assembled heirs were trying to convince themselves that their genetic modifications still meant something in a universe where baseline humans could casually dismantle their most enhanced warrior. The evening's final irony emerged as the bloodline representative realized that the species they had dismissed as laughably weak had just provided them with the most educational demonstration of practical strength in the Assembly's recorded history. The lesson was clear, though whether they would prove capable of learning it remained an open question for future diplomatic encounters.